Hello, everyone. I think we're pretty much bang on time. I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this online event on changing the rules of the game, how the Taliban has upended economic and political power in Afghanistan. My name is Mette Bestholm Jensen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, also known as XCEPT. Before we kick off today's discussion, just a quick bit of background on XCEPT and some housekeeping. On the housekeeping front, first, this event is being recorded, and we expect to make the recording publicly available afterwards for anyone who missed this live. Secondly, if you have any questions for our speakers today, and I do hope that you have lots of questions, please write them in the chat function on Zoom. During the Q&A, you won't be able to ask your questions verbally, so please write your questions, and you can ask anonymously if you prefer that. Finally, we'll be dropping an anonymous feedback form in the chat box towards the end of the event, and we'd be grateful if you'd take a couple of minutes to fill that out. Now, just to give a quick introduction to XCEPT and to today's discussion. XCEPT is one of the UK government's flagship conflict research programs funded by UK International Development. Our research examines conflict-affected borderlands, how conflicts connect across borders, and the drivers of violent and peaceful behavior, all with a view towards informing more effective policy responses. Our core partners that you can see on this map do longer-term research across a range of geographies, from the Sahel across Africa to the Middle East, and then to South and Southeast Asia. We also bring on quite a lot more partners through the XCEPT Research Fund, and the work on Afghanistan that we'll talk about today is a good example of how this fund offers a flexible commissioning platform for research on emerging or evolving issues. And it allows us to support and encourage research in particular that utilizes the sort of exciting mix of traditional and innovative research methods that we'll see here today, leveraging both remote technologies such as satellite imagery and open source investigations, for example. I'd encourage you to browse our website for more information about our activities and, of course, our publications and events and so forth. You'll see a report on some of the research David will be talking about today. And if you come back in another week or two, we'll have a follow-up report to that as well as a story map that provides a visual journey through some of this material. Now, turning to today's discussion, I think many of us were shocked by some of the scenes from Kabul in August 2021. But we were not exactly surprised, perhaps, when the Taliban swept into power as international forces departed. What's been more surprising, to me at least, has been the way in which the Taliban seems to have brushed aside not just the formal government, but the entire informal system of patronage, where power brokers across the country siphoned off huge amounts in rents, bribes, unofficial taxes, ghost salaries, etc., and controlled key security and administrative positions. That's no longer the case. The rules of the game really, truly have changed. And in today's webinar, David Mansfield will share findings from his research with Alcis, which has mapped and quantified some of these changes, giving us, I think, some pretty startling insights into the Taliban's quite deliberate efforts to maximize and centralize revenues and reshape economic and political power in Afghanistan. I'm sure many of you joining us today will be well familiar with David's work. With a PhD in development studies, David Mansfield has been conducting research on illicit economies in Afghanistan and on its borders since 1997, producing more than 80 research-based products on rural livelihoods and cross-border economies, many of them working in partnership with Alcis, as is also the case on the project we'll talk about today. I think it's fair to say that his book, A State Built on Sand, is a classic on how counter-narcotics efforts and failures played into the Afghan economy and politics and helped undermine efforts to build a credible government there. As a discussant, we're also very privileged to have with us today Dr. William Bird, who's been a senior expert on Afghanistan at the U.S. Institute of Peace since 2012. Bill has a doctorate in economics and a master's degree in East Asian regional studies and previously worked for many years at the World Bank, serving in roles focused on and based in China, India, Pakistan, and of course, Afghanistan, including as the World Bank's country manager in Kabul. A Chinese and Dari speaker, Bill has published widely, including 5 books on China and numerous other books and articles and reports, many of them on Afghanistan's economic development, drug industry, corruption, and economic cooperation in the wider Central Asia region. So very well placed to provide comments and questions on today's presentation. I'm very much looking forward to Bill's reflections, but first I will hand over to David for the session's main event. David, over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how.
Thanks, Meta. Yeah, we'll try a seamless switch between the two of us. Thanks for the plug for a book. That will help my retirement plan. And thank you to Bill for being a yet again another partner in crime. So I will share my screen, hopefully, and move on to the presentation. I will actually also stop my video because I can't see anything once I put the screen up, so you'll have to forgive me. So, okay, let's start with what we're going to talk about today. I will reduce that. I hope that was relatively seamless. So today, just going to give a quick refresh on the first piece of work that we did with XCEPT, Meta and the team, myself and Alcis, just because that's a sort of, it positions this subsequent piece of work quite well. Then we're going to focus down on these provincial case studies, these very in-depth pieces. I will try not to be too in-depth. After all, we only have an hour. And then subsequently conclusion, and then Bill's going to offer some comments and some Q&A. So essentially, that's the format. Briefly, though, a couple of words on methods. The idea here is to focus on the evidence, the empirical, what can be seen, and the experience of those directly involved in different aspects of cross-border value chains and how they function internally within the country. The idea is to avoid speculation. So we try not to talk to people about parts of journeys they don't take or jobs they don't do. So there's a real attempt here to focus on what we can know with a certain degree of confidence. We're never fully confident, but it's about cross-checking and checking again to be sure about what we're writing and saying. And of course, from that context, from that perspective, it's about using a variety of different data collection methods. The imagery is key, interviews are key, and then this geographic mapping and other sorts of sources of GIS data, which we are constantly drawing on. And if anything, we map a little too much on some occasions. So this is a real combination of methods to try and cross-check findings in a very robust way. So that's just a little bit of background. In terms of that first piece of work we did, it had a certain element of controversy at the time when we put it out and XCEPT released it. I think it was an interesting piece of work in terms of looking at these cross-border value chains post-Taliban takeover. It built on a body of work that we'd actually done with OTI, ODI, and a variety of other acronyms, and then consolidated under this big piece looking at, I think it was 7 border crossings and multiple border crossings, internal checkpoints within Afghanistan. What we found from that work was the fact that when the Taliban took over, they fundamentally, as Meta mentioned, they assembled the Republic's patronage system, the existing patronage system. That's not to say they didn't build their own. That'd be ridiculous to think they didn't. It's just that they dissembled that existing one, which in some ways had been the glue that held the government together. But at another point, at certain stress points, it was also what helped the government collapse so quickly. The second finding we had was the fact that the Taliban moved in quickly to enforce effective border management. On those 7 border crossings we looked at, we had another 3 that we were doing as part of a separate project. We saw them step in quite quickly to reconnect Asikuda systems, enforce what everyone used to refer to as the Ghani government rules. It wasn't that they created new rules at that point. They actually enforced what Ghani's government failed to enforce, or what officials within the Ghani government failed to enforce, because it was a vehicle by which to extract revenue. And then subsequently, part of that closing down that patronage system, enforcing that effective border management, was about centralizing revenues within the Taliban administration. You could argue particularly important in the context of an absence of donor money, because it becomes much more of a priority, which is a running theme here. So one part of that work was we mapped all these border crossings clearly, and then I think it was about 180 different checkpoints. These ones in blue are the informal checkpoints, essentially AMP, customs, various other people, collecting money on journeys that when a truck comes into Islam Color, it does the journey to Kabul, it has to pay at all of these different crossings, all these border crossings. Gets bad paperwork here, and then subsequently, because of that bad paperwork, has to make payments all the way along the line. And then there are these strategically placed Taliban checkpoints on these major thoroughfares as well. So when the Taliban took over, they formalized the border crossing. You didn't get fake paperwork. Your truck was weighed before and after. It was filled with freight. Quality control started to be taking place. We saw the Asikuda system, as I mentioned, reconnected to the computers, so it's harder to pass through with undeclared goods. And we saw this, subsequently, the paperwork the truck drivers carrying, the traders got, is subsequently checked along various checkpoints along here, but they're no longer collecting money apart from a payment on the scales. So you see this entire thing dissipate in terms of the existing system. And we didn't just that wasn't collected just through interviews, but it was also collected using the imagery side to just verify some of these findings. And if you want to know what effective border management looks like, I mean, this is the kind of thing. This is the boondocks of mile 78 out on the Farah border with Iran. You see this before the Taliban takeover under the days of the Republic. And then subsequently after the Taliban takeover, you see this change here. All of these new trucks are actually idle, waiting for business. But see down here, this becomes an interesting phenomenon. This little car park here is actually a whole host of fuel trucks waiting to be sent back to Iran for having adulterated fuel. You see the orderly queue of trucks that are coming in from the car park into the border. You see this. The Taliban actually impose a level of order, sending goods back that aren't of quality. It's not just fuel, it's other products. Something that we had not seen, or seen very rarely during the days of the Republic. So we see this visually, this reinforcement of effective border management. In Islam Color, it looks even better, because here it is, February 21, during the days of the Republic, just chaos. And subsequently, someone who's got a real issue with order, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that an authoritarian government essentially demands people park properly and does other things, but essentially look at the comparison in how this is structured once they take over. So we see this across the piece in different border crossings and in different structures. We looked at Haratan as well and these other places. So these changes, it's not just about the enforcement of rules, but we also see some of the infrastructural support to come around to support that as well. In Spin Bordat, for instance, this was done before the Taliban took over, getting up with thanks to, I think, probably an ADB project, actually, cross-border construction of the new Pakistani customs office, and we see a sort of a new turnstile put in. But then we also see post-Taliban takeover a new Afghan border police structure to be placed at the Spin Bordak as well. So you see these infrastructural developments that are designed also to reinforce structures to make sure that they can have good border management. It was one of the clear priorities the Taliban put in place to immediately step in. We mapped this from a calendar perspective in terms of the time series of when they got their Asikuda connected, when they put in these systems, so that they could reduce the outflow, dissipation, the dilution of monies into the hands of other people and bring it into the administration. So what did that mean financially? we tried to map this up in terms of the financial aspects of this and who was making money in terms of these different groups, be that the Taliban, be that informal tax, the blue that was being taken, all of those different 180 checkpoints I mentioned, and then the formal tax the government could collect at the border crossings as well. Now, what we realized to a large extent was that the government was only declaring 793 million in revenues at its borders. It was actually had the amount of undeclared goods. If they'd actually taxed on that, they could have been generating about 1.5 billion. But as a consequence of that bad system on the borders and those checkpoints in the interior, there were all of these different checkpoints taking the best part of 650 million that was being filtered off, clearly not by the ANP, but by those people who actually controlled checkpoints. This is valuable real estate. People who get the ANP people appointed, or the customs officials who then have to pay tribute to the people who are actually in charge of that area or in charge of that checkpoint. And, you know, this one here, this big amount of money here, it's been filtered off by people like Ismail Khan. Up here, it was Atta, and up down here, it was Razak, Silo in Kandahar for the convoys that used to go to Spin Bordak. Everyone's taking their cut. And of course, so is the Taliban. Difference with the Taliban is they have a series of checkpoints, and if you show you pay at Farah Rud, you subsequently get stopped at the Taliban checkpoint at Mucca, you won't have to pay again. That's not the case with the blue ones. You pay at each of these. So as people used to say, there are X many governments, or in this case, 180 different governments. But truck drivers would talk about their journey as being, there are 10 different governments on this road. That wasn't the case. The Taliban were already, as an insurgency, centralizing that system of financial payments in, so they didn't have this duplication and this filtering off to some degree. So when the Taliban take over, again, the checkpoints, internal checkpoints, are no longer collecting money. They are formalizing and centralizing the payments at the border crossings. And as a consequence, they can generate what we estimated to be the best part of $1 billion in revenues. So that was that piece. So we then wanted to take this and go, okay, so what does this really mean at a provincial level? How is this manifesting, not just in relation to the centralization of revenues and political power within these areas, but how's it playing out in terms of how decisions are made over the use of those monies? We answered some of those questions, but not all of them. What we found here were, there was some, certainly at the time we were doing our work, and it will have changed, of course, because this is such a dynamic situation. Shifting patterns of trades were taking place, significant ones in relation to existing trade patterns where significant amount of trade had been done by Iran, less was going into Pakistan, Central Asia was becoming prominent. So we'd seen this shifting pattern during the work that we were doing, but also infrastructural support to back it up again. So sort of reinforcing the findings we had from the first piece. Again, improved efficiency in generating revenues, and come on to that as we go through the findings. And this adeptness in exploiting these cross-border value chains, including formalizing smuggled goods as a way to offset losses elsewhere. This becomes even more interesting. And then just also, we tried something new, tried to look at political power and how it was being concentrated. And we found it was being concentrated in the hands of military class, largely from neighboring provinces, in both of the areas that we looked at, which was an interesting idea, which we've tried to map up. And then there may be no surprises here, but a Pashtun dominance in both security and economic sectors. Senior Pashtuns would be giving senior posts in key departments in provinces, even where they were not a majority. So, like I say, our focus of our work was on these three things: economic activity within these two provinces, revenue collection, and political power. We chose these two provinces because they were completely contrasting. We have Nimroz here, a border area, produces little, but has a significant cross-border value and in terms of transit trade through here, both legal goods and what were illicit goods. Some of them remain illicit goods. I mean, I think we were estimating it was about $2.1 billion worth of goods were passing through Nimroz in 2021, of which about 1.2 billion was legal. So big economy here in terms of transit trade, producing not so much. Samangan, an interior border, doesn't have these cross-border issues that we see in Nimroz, and fundamentally, heavily reliant on the coal industry. And we wanted to look at that because, in part, the coal industry and the significance that we were seeing from some other work that we were doing in the cross-border trade of minerals into Pakistan. So these were the two provinces we chose, quite contrasting, some similarities, and we wanted to see what kind of things that we were picking up that were common to both. So when it comes to that, one of the first things that we noticed in terms of the cross-border trade was how the Taliban takeover had resulted in some significant changes in the amount of trade that was taking place. We constantly hear as if the amount of trade is of a similar quantum on Taliban's on Afghanistan's borders post-Taliban takeover. But in fact, what we saw in Nimroz, in Malak, Zaranj, was that we went from about 360 trucks a day to around 60. Massive reduction taking place on this particular border. So, okay, so what does that mean in relation to the amount of revenue they can generate from that? Whilst in Samangan, we're seeing the coal industry just completely take off. Here you see imagery showing the number of coal mounds that were built up, new roads, new coal mines. It just takes off post-Taliban ban. It's almost like the Pakistanis secured a land border for a core mineral that they required for their variety of their industries once the Taliban took over. So we see this massive expansion in coal production and indeed the export into Pakistan primarily. This is Karachi. You can see just how many coal trucks. The joy of coal trucks is my good friends at Alcis can count them very easily, but just the sheer amount of trucks that are amassing the variety of different borders. Yeah, some borders closed to coal, like Talcum at one point, and then any restrictions are then picked up in another border like Karachi or Angarada, etc. You can see the scale of this uptick, and in fact, as I mentioned, you can even count the trucks. You see at Karachi, about 72% of the trucks passing through here is just the coal industry. It's great. Coal leaves a very clear visual signature, which is perfect for the imagery side. Now, clearly, again, this will have changed given the current fighting on this border. But big shifts in both areas in relation to the level of economic activity. But then we also see this rerouting taking place. So when it comes to the mines in Samangan and Dar es Suf, typically those trucks would travel all the way up here, dump. There'd be like the 30 metric tons of coal coming up to Mazar Sharif, dump here in the coal yards that have been set up by Governor Atta on key property, allegedly, some of his own business interests at stake. And then subsequently that coal would travel down to Kabul through Cheshire, picked up a nice Taliban checkpoint there. So what has been taking place more recently is this attempt to redirect it to a new coal yard that's been established in Hazrat-e Satan. No doubt, some of the explanations that the coal yards of Mazar are an environmental hazard has some foundations to it, but also this is a way of possibly rerouting away from any interest that may still persist in relation to Atta, but also there's a more direct route to the markets, essentially, in Pakistan. So we see this physical restructuring. That's the coal yard just down there, the new one that's established, complete with signposts. And this is the road that's being improved and the amount of traffic that we're starting to see along this. And the drivers are being compelled, asked to pay a new road tax for the improvement. But it's not just there. We also see a big rerouting of goods and trade through from Nimroz, from Zaranj, through to Pakistan. Now, this we were familiar with as a consequence of essentially the people smuggling business, which for some years now, since the Iranians built the wall here in 2012, this was no longer as easy to cross the border here for a variety of different smugglers, including people smugglers. So they started to redirect the journey through Baluchistan and down here south into Pakistan and into Mashkel and onto into Iran there. You can see Dak here. So it's a cross-border location. And again, infrastructural support. Let's see how much this has changed. You can see this is Dak in 2020. Just look at it by 2023. All of those different buildings, tents. I mean, this is a place that now has, I think it has phone lines, it has internet, it has money changers. God knows what else is going on here. So this is now a big cross-border value place where cross-border goods are an entrepot for cross-border goods, which can include fertilizer coming in from Pakistan, fertilizer and sugar coming in from Pakistan to Afghanistan, cars, tires, other vehicle parts, and people coming out of Afghanistan into Pakistan. And you see a couple of checkpoints, both north and south of the town, which are controlling movements in and out. So, again, infrastructural support to support these rerouting and changes of trading patterns. And that increase there is offsetting the decrease that we see in Malak. So next questions were, okay, what does this mean in terms of revenue? What's taxed and where? Which institutions are responsible? How are different taxes being processed? How are revenues spent? We couldn't get anywhere on that. That was a no-go from a research point of view. But what we started to see, and if you look at the way this is all mapped, each of these little dots is $10,000. This is during the days of the Republic. And you can see this focal point. Again, this is the real estate, not only for the government at Malak, but also for a variety of different corrupt officials who are taking monies in Zarand, where the government is at its height during the days of the Republic. And you also see a number of checkpoints where money's been taken that the ANP have. And of course, we estimated it was about 41 million being taken by those corrupt officials, and about 50 million in Gorgari by the Taliban. Well, sorry, it was about 40 million in Gorgari, plus some Usha and some drug slabs, took it up to 50 million. So the total amount of money's being collected. These were the different institutions, these were the different actors involved. Subsequently, with the Taliban takeover, you start to see revenues have gone down, 92 million to 83 million. What becomes quite interesting is, again, each of those points, 10,000. So the density, the bold points is where the real money's being collected. You see three locations where that's taking place. You see a new place here, north of Malak, called Sarishela and Kang, where both drugs for a certain period of time and smuggled fuel no longer becomes smuggled because it becomes formalized, is moving through. And we were estimating about 9 million was being collected there in taxes, and a further, I think it was about 26 million at this point in Sarishela, in Sabz-Ghazi, which is essentially the tax point for goods that are coming to and from Dak. So we have this new change, this shift around what goods what taxes are being collected on what goods and in what locations following the Taliban takeover. We have none of the checkpoints along the road and the unofficial payments, but we have this evolution here. So what we actually start to see is complete shift in what monies are being collected on what goods. Drugs becomes about 8 million worth until March 2023, when the collection of tax on drugs was banned, not just in Kang, but other places. So that was here. We see Usha, the agricultural tithe, being collected by the Ministry of Agriculture, making up about 10 million. And then we see what were, in quotation marks, smuggled goods through Dak, making up about 27 million of that total 83 million. So the combination of drugs and smuggled goods are equal to the amount of official goods passing through Malak in terms of the revenues collected. So we see this offsetting taking place. Any reduction in Malak was being compensated for by these other routes that have fallen now as a consequence of this tax disappearing, and also other changes in trade that have no doubt taken place since the work was done. We see these other institutions step in. The Economic Commission is responsible for both Sari Shela and Sabz Ghazi, but then we have Mail step in. I mean, agricultural tithe, the Taliban collect it as an insurgency, and they formalize that when they take power. The Republic never collected that money. Unclear why. Could be argued they didn't control the rural space. Could also be argued the fact that they didn't need the money because they had donors who were providing. But what's also quite interesting when we start looking at the people who are responsible for these new collections, be it in Ministry of Agriculture, be it in the Economic Commissions, etc., these individuals who are placed in those posts have a background in collecting money during insurgencies. We'll touch on it a bit later, but they're not the military people. They were the financial people. They sat in Cheshmashir in Baghlan collecting money on the main road, on the route through Kabul, or they sat in Farah as part of the commission collecting money during the insurgency on a variety of different goods. They're now in formal posts in charge of the economic commissions and Ministry of Agriculture. So they don't just put anyone in charge of the money. They have a history and an experience of collection. We see the same thing taking place in relation to Samangan in terms of this dilution, this dissipation of monies collected. You can see the formal Afghan Republic's only collecting about 21 million, according to our estimates. Money's being filtered off in the informal in relation to all the checkpoints that run up to Mazar Sharif and subsequently down to Kabul, these blue points. And then we have the Taliban collecting all that money at Cheshmashir, partly because of the sheer amount of trucks that are passing through, many of them NATO, many ironically not paying tax or goods for NATO. But the Taliban is actually not paying tax to the Republic, but are paying tax to the Taliban when they pass through Cheshmashir. So Taliban has a nice checkpoint, a nice revenue earner there. And then when they take over, we see Mail step in again. Not a lot of money. They seem very keen on standing over anyone who's harvesting their hing as a valuable crop. No surprises there. The real money is collected on the mines as a consequence of basically putting up the royalties from about, I think it was about $6 to $34 at the mines, but also the level of production starts to take place and the absence of the undeclared goods and the amount of production that is not being taxed at the mines and then subsequently at the borders. So we have this fundamental shift take place. Ministry of Mines becomes a much more valuable asset than possibly it was in the past, certainly in a formal sense in terms of the money it's raising. Although no doubt there are some very interesting things going on in terms of who gets the contracts on various public mines rather than private mines. What we also see, aside from this, other sources of revenue, other goods, other institutions step in, is the way the Taliban have proved quite adept at working these value chains. And I'll show you an example of that and how they prove to be quite pragmatic in the way that they actually engage on extracting financial benefits so as not to undermine their support. They quite a few changes in policies for people who are zealots on other things. So if we look at something, I mean, this goes back to this whole argument. There's often a sort of statement that Taliban's increased taxes. One, I'd suggest that have they actually increased the tax rate, or is it the fact that business people are actually being asked to pay for something they didn't pay in the past? In some cases, they have indeed increased the tax rate. This is drugs. During the days of the insurgency, they collected about $1 a kilo on the route from Bakwa to Kang. Now they at the point when they were collecting taxes up to March 2023, they increased it to about $6.66 a kilo. But there was a massive reduction in the amount of bribes that were being paid to the point of $9.20. And look at the price of opium now. So in fact, those people who were trading drugs, yeah, the tax went up by $5.66, but their profit margin has gone up by over $80 a kilo. So I think we need to be clear on our terms. We see exactly the same thing with fuel, smuggled fuel, and the fact that again, profit margins have increased. In the past, there was no tax. It was all bribes on fuel passing through Kang. Now there's a tax of 33 cents a bushka. But so what? You've actually saved 52 cents because there's less corruption from checkpoints along the route from Kang to Zaranj. So clarity of terms there. But that's where we were on the finances. This is a quick run through on this in relation to the levers of power. This is something we've tried to do, trying to make sense of in terms of looking at who had what posts during the Republic, or who had political power within the province of Nimroz and Samangan, who's now taken over. How do we understand that in terms of how power is actually used and who holds it? We also wanted to look beyond the province itself and look at what linkages they had to key players both in Kabul and Kandahar. So this was an attempt to map this. Again, a bit like the mapping of values. Each point represents a value, which is a value of political power, which is a function of a variety of different calculations around your military background, the post you have, the people that you can draw on from the center, etc. And each color is an ethnic is part of particular tribes that exist within the area. So what you see during the days of the Republic, all of this red area is under Taliban. We see this concentration of power within the administration of the Republic, largely divided between Pashtuns and the Baluch. Primarily, this is sitting with the Nasir family of Kang. The Baz Mohammed was, I think he was the provincial council. His brother was head of the Afghan border police and strangely had a sideline in cement production in a factory. And his brother was an MP. We see him and his cohorts monopolizing certain posts, etc., within Nimroz. We also see the Brahui family. Abdul Karim, I think he was the governor 4 times. His son ended up being deputy governor just before the government fell, and he was also the district governor in their home area of Chalbajan. When the Taliban come in, we see this massive shift take place. We see all these Pashtuns come in. I think there were 28 out of 43 positions that we looked at actually weren't just Pashtun, they were Nurzai Pashtuns. The provincial governor, the original Khalid Abid, was subsequently replaced by who was from Bakwa. He's a Nurzai. Rafi, his replacement from Nurzai from Shindan. Across the piece, Nurzai Pashtuns take over all of these different positions and dominate this area. And they're all from neighboring areas. We see a similar situation take place in Samangan. Again, you have this broader collection of tribes, groups that are involved in the administration and in power locally. And we see I don't think we'd seen a Pashtun governor for 21 years. We see all of these technocrats being appointed from Kabul. We see this political bargaining between Bush and other political parties over who has governor and key posts in this. It changes hands quite considerably. And then subsequently, yes, we see a minority of posts going to Pashtuns, but they get economic jobs, they get the security jobs, they get the first time they're the governor under Kunduzi. And again, they are from neighboring areas rather than from Samangan itself. I think clearly the governor is from Kunduz, so is the chief of police. I think the head of the GDI at the time was from Baglan, as was the person in charge of the Economic Commission. So they dominate the key posts within this administration. And just to try and track that in relation to Nimroz in terms of this idea of people coming in from outside, essentially those people who fought in against the government, the Republic in those areas from other areas. We tried to map this in terms of the district of origin of the people who are now in post. You see in the Republic, we had a few people from outside. These are technocrats coming in, posted from Kabul. A lot of the power sits with these local actors, these local powerful actors. So these are sort of far closer to Zaranj as this central point. And then when we come to the Taliban era, many of them are coming from Herat, Nurzais, Farah, Nurzais, Helmand, Nurzais, and of course the northern part of Nimroz itself, which is Bakwa, and again, largely Nurzais. So, just as a way of pushing through this, see most of these posts go to people from military backgrounds, from neighboring provinces. That's just across the piece. It's a kind of winner takes all. They're the conquering power. We see the Pashtun dominance, key posts in each province, despite the fact that Pashtuns are not a majority in either. We see this technocrats, as I mentioned earlier, coming into key economic ministries. They're not the fighters. They're the revenue raisers. And they, during the insurgency, and they take those posts once the Taliban takes over. And we see this local representation in the new administration, largely in these district posts, minor posts, but also in the provincial Alima Council. And it raises the question of how much the Alima Council is, as alleged, as said, is Habitulla's way to have direct connections to the provinces and keep an eye on what's going, but also how much of it is to have local representation as a mediation between the population who sees these people in positions in the provincial administrations as outsiders from neighbouring provinces, as conquerors. So, just quickly, as I'm running short, my apologies for overrunning, just a quick conclusion. Across the piece here, we see this priority given to mobilising revenue by the Taliban as they take over. It's not per se that their attempts to clean up some of the corruption on the borders is about centralising that revenue within their own, rather than seeing it dissipate into rival powers or even, hopefully, their own factions in some cases. We see it across, as I say, it's just priorities that they put through their point of these departments, the broadening of the tax base and this new revenue raising departments, strict enforcement, the weighing of trucks that never used to take place before and after the freight, even along the roadsides as they travel in the interior. This maintaining of economic relationship with neighbours, even when there's a dispute, despite shootings at Kang over the water supply, allegedly, there's still the borders are open, still things are working. We could argue that's changing with Pakistan. The way the tax rates are established and negotiated, we see repeated efforts by the Bazaris to step in when they perceive that tax rates are too high and are cutting their margins. And we hear of people basically saying, look, if I have a complaint, I can actually reach the head of customs in Malak or in Islam Kala, in contrast to the past where they were concealed behind multiple layers of bureaucrats. And then, as I say, this centralisation of payments through the Asakuda into the Ministry of Finance, even for what were once smuggled goods. I think the big question becomes, and this is the one that none of us are hopefully someone's better at answering than we are, how are these monies distributed? They've become much more efficient at collecting money, but where's the money going? Particularly given this dominant cadre of Taliban fighters, primarily Pashtuns, that now occupy these positions of power, not just in Kabul and Kandahar, but in these provinces where the Pashtuns are minorities, such as Nimroz and Samangan. If anyone can answer that question, I welcome that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That covered quite a lot of ground and a lot to think about here. In the interest of time, I want to go straight to Bill for your reflections on this whirlwind tour of what's happened in Afghanistan since August 21. Bill, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak at this event showcasing the excellent research just presented. I would argue strongly this is very important and high quality work. It provides a reliable, granular political economy perspective on the major changes brought about by the Taliban in the wake of their August 2021 takeover of the country, based on case studies of two rather different Afghan provinces. I realize I'm largely repeating points just made by David, but among the many insights that emerge from this research, three key ones in my view are the following. First, the effective Taliban focus on raising revenue. And this is consistent with the macroeconomic data, which suggests that they have succeeded in maintaining total revenue largely unchanged despite the major decline in the economy that occurred after August 2021. Second is the wholesale change in elites and the Pashtunization of the top levels of provincial administration in both provinces, typically with Pashtuns from nearby provinces. This is something that's an important thing. It would be good to have more provinces studied to see if that pattern holds in other provinces as well. And third, related, is the introduction of experienced, qualified Taliban figures into key security and economic positions. The latter, at least, can even be called technocrats, as David does, having experience with finances and revenue raising during the insurgency. All three of these themes resonate with what we are seeing at the central government level. Just as one example, Taliban from their insurgency period Finance Commission have been appointed to top positions in the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. My one plea I have is to really encourage the authors to take on a few more provinces. 2 is a good start, but adding 2 to 4 more in different parts of the country and with different economic underpinnings would double or triple the size of the sample. And this would provide valuable insights on common themes that emerge, as well as any diversity in the changes brought and in the Taliban approaches toward local administration and control. Finally, let me just close with a few broader reflections from a strictly empirical and non-normative perspective, i.e. not saying anything good or bad, just laying out some stylized facts. These may be worth discussing further in the light of this important research and the excellent presentation. The Taliban regime is probably the strongest government and political movement in Afghanistan in the last 45 years. Both because of some strengths it has, but also because for the first time since perhaps the first couple of post-2001 years, there's no serious armed opposition, let alone one supported and armed by outside countries. This is really a different situation than was faced in the last 3 to 4 decades. Also, in many respects, the Taliban, unlike their previous incarnation in the 1990s, when they were still fighting a civil war, of course, they have been engaged in what could be called good practice authoritarian state building. They have, despite some tensions, maintained the unity of their movement. They have, as this research convincingly shows, focused on mobilizing and controlling revenue, as well as spending it non-transparently, as David noticed, and that is probably in the best interest of their regime. We could say something about the Taliban budget expenditures, but just leaving it that spending it non-transparently allows them to use it for regime strengthening and preservation, and that's probably in their best interest. They have focused on security in the negative sense of absence of organized armed violence and have cracked down on dissent wherever it appears. This is the typical authoritarian regime response to dissent and resistance. Going the other route of reforms and greater inclusiveness is often perceived as a sign of weakness and starts down a slippery slope toward regime collapse. So all these are elements of what might be called the authoritarian playbook that such governments around the world use to entrench themselves and stay in power. The Taliban have also been helped by inheriting a functioning government administration. They've tried to build on this foundation, which they did not have at all in the 1990s. But in some areas, they have brought in their own institutions, notably, I would say, intelligence, the GDI, and the justice sector, supplanting and replacing the Islamic Republic era agencies. The Taliban have also made some moves which appear to be serious mistakes, even from the narrow point of view of their own regime self-interest. I would single out the ban on girls' education at secondary level and beyond, which is unpopular even among the Taliban, and also the restrictions against women working. And the opium ban and the way it is being enforced is another prominent example. These may reflect, possibly, but this is speculative, the triumph of ideology over authoritarian good practice. So we will need to watch closely developments in areas like these, as well as what might be expected as a normal evolution of an authoritarian regime. For example, a probably inevitable tendency for corruption to increase, pressures on revenue as that tightens up, etc. But as long as there's no significant externally supported armed opposition against the regime, it will most likely be the internal Taliban dynamics and their interactions with the Afghan population in country that at some point may lead to change. This kind of research, which David has done with Alcis, if it continues, will shed important light on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think implicitly you have outlined, I think, a really exciting and ambitious actually research agenda for us here with these comments and sort of follow-up questions. There's a lot here to dig into. We have some questions in the chat as well. I want to make sure that we leave time to come back for those as well. But David, quickly, do you want to come back on some of these observations? I mean, Bill has covered a lot here. I mean, including some, I think, really inconvenient, unpleasant sort of facts about the strength really of the Taliban regime at this moment in time. I find it interesting also in the right after August 21, international media was very focused on how much weaponry that the Taliban had taken over, and hardly anyone talked about the fact that they were also taking over a relatively functional state and what sort of position that's actually put them in. And I think your research also shows some of the implications of that. In any event, do you want to quickly come back on Bill's reflections, and then we'll go to questions also. Again, thank you so much, Bill. Also really interesting. David.
Yeah, sure. Bit worried about Bill volunteering us for more provinces, but yeah, I mean, clearly it would make sense, and clearly you'd go for the usual suspects: the Herats, the Balkh, the Kandahars, the Nangarhars, in part because of their cross-border points. I mean, that's where we saw so much money flow into local power brokers during the days of the Republic, and you also have to wonder, over what time frame you can maintain this degree of centralization if there's not enough dividend going to those who fought the war. And so you do sort of recognize some of these tensions that exist. So yeah, I mean, other provinces would be great. As I say, I think there's some obvious ones to do, but there's some less obvious ones in terms of the fact that they don't see such a significant cross-border movement of legal goods and other goods. I choose the Badakhshans of this world and the Helmands myself, because I think there are some interesting sort of accommodations that take place with reference to our other work around drugs, etc. The fact that Badakhshan walks away with no ban imposed, 23 and possibly 24. They've appointed a new governor who's a Pashtun from Maiwand. He's now starting to appoint Pashtuns in Faizabad. But most of the people are Badakhshi, most of the district governors, etc. So there's a real tension there, and I think that political, economic dynamic, the locals know banning drugs in that area would be really problematic and politically destabilizing in a place that already has had conflict and violence last year. And then, of course, Helmand, because, I don't know, it just seems to be a place that is constantly given concessions. They have the inventory. They've seen the price rise of opium. They don't pay Usha, it seems, when everyone else pays it and even have slips to prove it. They allegedly have ghost workers in the military. So, and of course, everyone's allegedly afraid of Haji Zakia coming to some prominent position of power. So there's these two distinct provinces that don't have cross-border, well, they don't have formal cross-border trade. They do have cross-border trade. Baramchari is, after all, open to trade to some degree. So there's some real interesting contenders there. But, is there enough hours in the day? Yes, probably. In terms of some of what you say around, again, the authoritarian, you see it, I see a Taliban that is being very adept at making sure they keep enough of political players on side in relation to the Bazaris. You saw it with the smuggled fuel. They closed down that business initially when the Taliban took over. They reopened it in early 2022 as a consequence of a dialogue between the Alima, provincial Alima from Nimroz going directly to Habitullah saying, look, we need this business. This is an important cross-border value chain from a Bazari point of view, from the business point of view, but also from the interests on this border. And they were subsequently granted. It's no longer smuggled 3 days a week. And a tax. It was regulated. You see, with people smuggling.
David, can I come in on that point with a question also that's been posted in the Q&A, and please post your questions. Somebody has observed or asked if you can explain more about what smuggled goods are taxed. You talk about how smuggled goods, in some respects, have sort of made up for the deficit in formal goods. Our participant here says that you understand that the Taliban are being quite skilled at stopping potential opponents using goods such as drugs and logs to generate revenue, for example, but also reflecting that with more effective control on the border, how does that reconcile with what we hear about goods smuggled to Pakistan, resulting in a large inflow of foreign currency that might cause the exchange rate in Afghanistan to appreciate? And I'd be interested in Bill's views on that as well. I know you follow the economy in Afghanistan very closely. So any views, either of you have on that, but the question initially specifically on smuggled goods, and then perhaps we can move on to the foreign currency question that's related to that from the chat. Thanks.
In terms of the smuggled goods that we see passing through Nimroz into Pakistan and vice versa, we see it's many of the goods that used to pass through Sasabai from Nangarhar into Pakistan. So it's the sugar coming in, it's the fertilizer coming in from Pakistan to Afghanistan. On the way out, it's the cars that used to be taken apart and put on camels. Strangely, believe it or not, on the way from Afghanistan to Pakistan, they now pass through Dak. As I say, tires, car parts, and the variety of other goods. So there's a combination of different goods. Some of them that used to use ports of crossing where the Pakistani fence has prevented that from taking place, and they're now passing primarily through Dak. In terms of what effect that has on the currency, the exchange rate, Bill, I'll leave that to your far more expert opinion.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, actually, David and Alcis's work sheds light on what is a puzzle on the macroeconomic data, that imports have gone up. Exports, after going up a while, are somewhat plateauing. So the trade deficit official data is increasing, but the currency is very strong. And I think this reinforces one hypothesis by the World Bank that they've about why this is happening, is that the Taliban are actually including smuggled imports into the tax system and collecting duties on them, but they're not including them in the reporting, and there's not much real tax on exports anyway. They're not including them on the export figures, obviously, because they're being smuggled into Pakistan. So I think that may provide a partial explanation of why the currency is so strong, which, by the way, is a mistaken policy in a weak economy. And the other ones, of course, are the UN cash shipments, $40 million or so a week of cash dollars being shipped into the country. And possibly remittances also may have gone up in response to the worsening economic situation. But I think David's work does reinforce this argument made more hypothetically by the World Bank. It looks at the types of imports that were there and saying, how can machinery imports, which may include cars, et cetera, be increasing when the economy is so weak? And the answer is that the Taliban are now recording and collecting tax on these smuggled imports, but they're not getting into the export data.
Thanks. Yeah, I think so. Somewhat related to that, because we continue to see official numbers also being published from Afghanistan, in addition to various international bodies like the World Bank. In the Q&A, somebody asks or reflects that it's amazing that XCEPT data has continued to be collected since August 21, and asks if it's still publicly available. And David, I think you definitely have views also on the quality of some of this data, but also potentially how the Taliban uses data to signal the state of its revenues and its governance.
From what I can gather, XCEPT data is not publicly available, and I'm not sure Afghan XCEPT data ever was. Bill, was it? The issue during the days of the Republic were many of the computer connection between the scales. The computer was often dismantled by officials from the Republic who didn't want to have that verification and wanted to allow goods to pass through undeclared. And there were repeated stories of that. I mean, I always thought the great Afghan Analyst Network interview with Khaled Payenda was great, where he just talked about the level of corruption at the borders being mind-boggling. And we spoke to Khaled at one time, and he said, yeah, it's at least 50% out as a consequence of many of the issues that we've raised around the border. So I think it's interesting that if the Taliban was really interested in that level of accountability, maybe they put the XCEPT data out there. But from my understanding, that continues to be and I'm not sure what the policies are for other governments, but it continues to be not shared with the wider world, which means that you can get into these challenges around the data in terms of the inclusion of smuggled goods. Because at one point, Taliban was taxing drugs. Where was that going in terms of the data sets? These other smuggled goods, which are no longer smuggled within Afghanistan because there's a formalization and a regulation around them, but they're smuggled once they get into Pakistan. So, these values and these things, where are they being hidden within the data sets that the World Bank and others put out and sort of look to check? Bill will be better positioned to answer.
Bill, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I don't. The raw XCEPT data was accessible to researchers. And I think even now is somewhat accessible to organizations like the World Bank, but it never was, the raw data was never made public. But you have the NSIA, which is the National Statistics Agency, continues to publish data. And it's in the macroeconomic data, I think it's no more reliable than it was. On the trade data, they do publish things, and the World Bank basically uses those. It doesn't do a lot of research, for example, into what the opium economy should be as a share of GDP, what happens when opium production is stopped, but the inventories are being run down, so exports of drugs may not be declining as much, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, I would just end on this, or end my comments on this question, is that this is, I think, another example of the Taliban effectively and probably more effectively, definitely more effectively collecting the Ghani taxes. They're also effectively using these systems that were set up, not only the XCEPT, but this Treasury single financial account. And also, as far as we know, the expenditure data is also recorded as it was under, what was it called? I forget the name of the software, but it was, but it's not being made public anymore. My suspicion, a lot of it, and even this spend, what little we know suggests the Taliban are spending as much on security as the previous government did from their own budget, which is, is interesting because there's not that level of violent conflict at all. But to me, it may also be a good thing, either to keep people happy, as David suggests, or just as a imperfect but somewhat viable demobilization DDR mechanism to keep these former Pashtun, former Taliban fighters happy enough that they don't start forming their own predatory militias, et cetera.
Thanks, Bill. I realize that we are actually a bit over time, but if you will indulge us for just another minute, I want to end with another question from the Q&A, which allows us to do perhaps also just a little bit of crystal balling. Bill, you explained the sort of the current strength, perhaps of the Taliban, and somebody has commented that when traveling around Afghanistan, people there seem relatively optimistic with the ban on girls in schools after grade 6 and working in certain jobs, providing a very clear exception to that sort of overall optimism. Do we have a sense about public opinion, or sort of how the general mood is developing? And perhaps more broadly, sort of what's in store for the Taliban? They've been able to make up the deficit in revenues to some extent, but I think the expectation also is, is that amount of UN money coming in, donor patience is running out, partly because of the ban on girls and women's jobs. Some of that international funding is likely to decrease in the very near future. So what's your sense of the mood and where it's going in Afghanistan, and what that might mean for the Taliban's ability to continue to control the place? Perhaps Bill, you first, if you want to offer just some concluding comments, and then David for final comments.
Sure. Well, one point again, I'm in the empirical mode, not normative. So saying authoritarian is necessarily bad is not what I was intending to say, even though it does have perhaps a bad connotation in many circles. Yeah, it's really hard to predict. I would guess, one thing, the Taliban are not directly responsive or accountable to the bulk of the Afghan people. And, the opium ban, in my view, shows that they're not even responsive to poor Pashtun farmers in the rural heartland of the insurgency. So I think, this kind of linkage between popular dissatisfaction and regime change, if you want to call it that, is going to be very tenuous, as it is in other countries. I mean, look at Iran. It's now going on 45 or so years since that regime came into power. And despite well-organized, peaceful opposition, and some armed opposition too, for that matter. So that's why I was arguing what will happen. Will it be the internal dynamics? I think the opium ban. I think at some point the economy's weakness will also make it harder to raise revenue, and then there'll be pressures on how to spend that money within the Taliban that might cause tensions. But yeah, and just the point on the question, I think is right. Especially in rural areas, which were subject to fighting and drone strikes and all that, there's been some improvement in perception. And as a reliable World Bank study shows, more girls are going to primary school in rural areas of Afghanistan than during the war. So definitely a mixed picture. And in that point, I think the question is what is on the mark.
Thanks. David, any final reflections from you, and we'll
yeah, just on that point, it depends how long certain economic crises go on, in terms of if there's further shrinkage in the amount of assistance that goes into the country, other shocks that may be experienced in terms of ongoing drought, or these are all things that rural households find very difficult to cope with in the best of times. But if you layer that on top of this opium ban, it becomes quite difficult. Now, again, here we need to understand the differentiated effect of that ban. If I'm a landed farmer who has inventory from previous years and has grown lots of opium, and as a consequence of a ban, the price goes up from $100 to $1,000, you've just increased my purchasing power and my capital. Thank you very much. But if I'm landless or land poor, I now have significant problems. Now, as long as it's the landless and the land poor, you could argue, so the ban can carry. But at the point at which your political constituency, the landed of the Southwest, start to feel the pain, then the tensions start to rise, the economic consequences have a political ramification, and this is where we'll start to see some some real, on top of those other shocks that constantly hit rural households in Afghanistan, this is a real problem for them, and I'm yet to see what the real benefits are in the longer term. So I think we will have to watch that one to see how it plays out in the coming year, 2 years.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think we're all sort of following closely, and your analysis also that a lot of the pressures here in many respects are coming from inside Afghanistan, and indeed from inside the Taliban and their decisions and prioritization. We're well over time, so we should wrap up. There are more questions, and regret not being able to get to them. Do stay tuned and check out the website. We'll have a report up in the next week or two, which will address a number of the questions that were posed in the chat and that we didn't get to. And also, if you could take a couple of minutes to respond to the feedback survey that's in the chat, would be grateful. It helps us continuously sort of improve these sorts of events. And then just to say thank you to everyone for joining, and especially, of course, to David for some really fascinating interest or fascinating research. I'm excited to see further follow-up to all of this. And a big thanks also to Bill, whom, as I started out saying, I think has outlined a really ambitious research agenda for us with his comments also on what we have seen here. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you for another event soon. Take care.